previously spelt or some other heirloom wheat rather than some of our modern varieties. So after my experiments, I used to say regenerative organic agriculture has a future. And after visiting, however, over the last couple of decades, organic farms and being involved with organic projects and experiments all over the world, I now say that regenerative organic is the future. It's the only future that makes sense. And it's the only future that's sustainable. So, let me tell you a story about my conversion and the change of thought regarding the commodity mentality, which I was raised with. I was at a food show in the early 90s. A lady came up to me just right out of the crowd. I never saw her before. I've never seen her since. I don't even know her name. And yet, and I forget kind of what she looks like, but I'll never forget what she said to me. She reached out her hand, and she shook mine very, very firmly, and she looked right in my eyes, and she said, "Thank you for growing food for my family." And I thought, wow. No one's ever thanked me for growing food for their family before, ever. No one's even thanked me for growing food. In fact, we didn't really think about it as food. We thought of it as commodities, and we talked about it as commodities. We talked about getting rid of last year's crop and hauling it to town and putting it in the bin and all the things that really were part of what we did, but it wasn't engendered any feeling of sacredness, that's for sure. And you know, farmers in Montana, grain farmers, big grain farmers, do not go to farmers markets. We never see our end customers. Most of Montana's high-protein wheat is sent to Asia. It goes to Japan and Korea, and we never see any of those folks. Besides, it's blended off with the lower protein stuff out of Kansas, so they don't even get the pure stuff. And that's the way it is. When I would haul my grain to town, I'd drive up to the elevator in a big truck, and I'd dump it, and the elevator manager would come out, and he'd take samples as it was being dumped, and then he'd start pawing through the bucket of the sample, even before I finished lowering the truck bed and with the hoist. And he was looking for something that he could use. He was looking for defects that he could use as an excuse to pay me less than the market price. And that was the thanks I was used to. So when this lady said this to me, it struck me as like a thunderbolt. And I'll tell you truly, I went home from that food show to my farm, and I never grew another commodity again on my farm. The only thing I grew was food, was healthy food, food to sustain people, to make them well, and for their enjoyment. And that gave me a great satisfaction I hadn't really felt before. But it changed the way I looked at my farm and the way I thought about what I was doing. So let me tell you another story that really changed how I look upon wheat. And that was from our introduction of ancient grain. This is my parents and I at the first food show we ever attended in Anaheim, California, at the Natural Products Show in, I think it was 86. And my cousin and I were there selling our stone ground whole wheat flour and our Montana high protein wheat. And my dad had taken this little jar, and I don't have time to tell you the whole story. So it's in chapter 5, if you get a chance. So how we happened onto this ancient grain. But it's a whole nother story in itself. But we have this ancient wheat, and it was a novelty to us. It was giant. It looks like this. I always carry it on my hat because it's close I can get to my heart, you see. And it's something that was kind of unique. And after the end of 3 days and 1,000 people went by our stands, my cousin and I had our pockets full of business cards and referrals. We thought, wow, this is great. This is gonna turn out fantastic. And my dad had one business card and one referral, and actually they were the same person. And they wanted all we could grow. Well, all we had for seed at that time was enough to plant a half an acre, and that's what we did. And I thought, wow, there must be people who are interested in this. You know, we could get up to 40 or 50 acres. And we were told, well, I'll tell you, I'll give you a little hint. We were told it came out of King Tut's tomb. Isn't that a great story? And when I got to Cairo and I looked at the museum, I found it wasn't there, and that was kind of a downer. But wash your ears out with this. I went to Turkey to do some experiments, and the folks in Turkey said, oh, we know what this wheat is. We call it camel's tooth, or we call it the prophet's wheat. And I said, wow, that's really interesting. It's kind of shaped like a tooth, but I asked them, why do you call it the Prophet's Suite? Does it have anything to do with Muhammad? Because, I didn't want to, it's pretty Muslim there. I didn't want to get on the wrong side of that discussion. I was all by myself. And they said, oh, no, not that prophet. They said, the one with the boat. And I said, the boat? Said, do you mean Noah? Oh, yes. This is the grain Noah brought with him on the ark. And I said, wow, that's a lot better story than my old tomb story. So we've had a lot of fun with that. Well, when we went to Armenia, I had some friends from Armenia. It's right on the other side of Mount Ararat. They have the same legend. So what the good book says, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall all things be established. And I said, it's good enough for me. So anyway, that's where we are with that story. But that was my idea. And what happened, let me show you what happened, actually. So in 1986, we had one farm, ours. We planted half an acre. We had 0 products on the market. 30 years later, we had contracts with 250 organic farms, 100,000 acres spread over Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, and over 3,500 products on the market. 75% of the grain, this is mostly coming from Italy. 75% of all the grain goes to Italy. They thought it made the most wonderful pasta, and they just had to have it. It was something that they recognized from something they had in earlier days. Many of the people who were that old to remember before World War II. And now they had it back. And they were very, very enthused. So that was one thing. The taste and the aromas and the flavor was really driving this. Another thing that was driving this is something that was a total surprise to us that we had no idea about and would never have expected. And that came to light when we gave some to a good friend of ours about 50 miles away in Havre. And this lady, Laura Smith, could not eat wheat at all. She couldn't even get near it. And yet she did some kinesiology, some muscle testing, and she felt she could try it. So she tried some. And I said to my dad, I said, well, good night. How come you gave some to her? She, wheat makes her sick. And Dad says to me, he said, well, he says it's organic, isn't it? So you can see now my dad's more converted than I was. And she called up the next day and she says, what is this stuff? Because when I eat it, it makes me feel better. I said, whoa, well, we'll give you some more. So we gave her some more, and after a few days, she says, my sister can also not eat wheat, and she has many sensitivities to other foods. And I said, well, we'll send her a whole box. So we sent her a box of this pasta, and she ate it for several weeks, and she called up and reported that not only could she eat it, but after eating for several weeks, she was less sensitive to other foods that she had trouble with. And I thought, whoa. This is just not a novelty. This is it's like a gift. This is like a gift from the Creator that puts things on the earth for us in a very natural and normal way that was for our health and our benefit. And so I started, then the scientists came up on me again. I said, I wonder if we can figure out why that is. So we started, first, before I get to that story, we decided to use a trademark to protect the grain. Now, a trademark doesn't mean we own the grain. I believe that, the grain is a gift from God, and nobody should own life or patent it. But if you want to grow it, you're free to grow it. This is Coruscant. It's a near relative of durum. But if you want to make the claims that we're making with it, and you want to join the Keynote family of using the trademark, this is the reason we have the trademark, to make guarantees to our customers. And our guarantees are that this grain will be always organically grown. If it's Keynote, Coruscant, it'll be 100% ancient wheat. It'll be high in protein and minerals. And the claims that you have to tell the truth about it. That's kind of a novel idea for marketing, don't you think? And we're very serious about that, so that you can't make any claims that aren't substantiated with research. And so the research is where I really got excited. I made several calls throughout America. This is over 20 years ago. I couldn't find anybody that wanted to help me. The conversation would go like, well, Sonny, they'd call me Sonny. Well, Sonny, they'd say, most of this wheat sensitivity stuff, well, that's all in their head. And if I did these kind of tests, I would be wasting my time and your money. And I thought, oh, well, good, thank you very much. And I didn't find anybody who really was interested in making the comparisons and being serious about it. When I got to Italy, however, there was a different attitude. The Italians, any Italians in here? A few, okay. Okay, you know how Italians feel about their pasta? They can't eat their pasta. They just don't run down to the corner store and ask for some gluten-free, wheat-free pasta or something. They want, what's the matter with my pasta? And they want it fixed. And so there was an interest, even though the problem wasn't as big there as it was here, it was still showing up. And some of the researchers were very, very interested in trying to understand what was going on. So we found a team from the University of Bologna and the University of Florence, the research hospital there, who came together and we started doing studies. And over the last 10 years or so, we started with the rat study, and then when we found that there was anti-inflammatory properties, and we were looking for antioxidant properties actually, increasing antioxidant capacity, we found something we didn't expect, and we knew that inflammation is tied to all chronic disease. So we started then studying human chronic diseases, clinical studies with human, with people who were sick with either diabetes, irritable bowel syndrome, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver syndrome, even fibromyalgia. And all of the studies were very, very similar in the results. We divided the people into two groups. One would be fed ancient grain with our Keynote brand Coruscant, and one would be fed modern wheat. And they would be fed bread, pastas, crackers, even flour we gave them. They could make whatever they wanted. We told them not to eat any wheat except for what we gave them. We had to tell particularly the IBS guys a little bit of a fib. We said, well, we're going to try two different diets, and I think both of them will help you feel better, because the mentality of how people look at what they're eating can really, the placebo effect is huge. And if they think something is going to make them sick, it starts to. And it's a very big change. We didn't want to add that variable to our research. The cardiovascular, this was really an interesting study. The professors, after they took all my money, they told me later, they said, much later, they said, well, we didn't think we were going to see anything in this study, because all of these people were already on a half a dozen, some up to 10 different drugs, because they all had heart attacks. And so the main goal was to prevent a second heart attack. One guy had 3 heart attacks. Boy, I was afraid he was going to die, but he didn't. So I was happy about that. And not just because to make the experiment go right. I was just, glad he was okay. But anyway, what we saw with the drugs is that it had an additional ability to lower cholesterol, to increase antioxidant capacity, and all these things like this cholesterol is being lowered by statins. But the diet of the ancient grain lowered it another 8% or so. This is astounding to the researchers. The biggest difference, I should say also in particularly in the diabetic study, we saw a big drop in blood sugar, in insulin and insulin resistance. In all the studies, we saw an increase in magnesium, zinc, and calcium in the blood with the ancient grain. But the biggest difference that was consistent through the whole thing was the difference in the anti-inflammatory properties. And with the human studies, we're looking at cytokines as indicators. And there are differences between 30 and 45%. There's no pills that can do that. And so it was really an amazing discovery, really. And we don't know the mode of action. It's probably not just one thing. It's probably a multitude of things. But all these advantages in the past that I'm sure used to exist in many of the wheats that we used to eat now have been traded off for high yields, low cost, and productivity efficiencies. I'll just mention a couple here to give you some examples of how that works. So everybody wants higher yields. So the wheat breeders they're at our service, right? They're going to make higher yields, and they start with the farmers. One of the ways they were able to do that was to lower the height of the wheat to get higher yields. They also made it more disease resistant, more resistant to insects, and more able to respond to heavy doses of chemical artificial nitrogen. And all those are very good goals. But what happened was a lot of unintended consequence. But it's not just at the farm. So then you got to the mill. Well, they wanted higher yields of white flour because that's the main commodity. It's white flour. So they wanted the bran to be made harder and harder, so it's easier and easier to flake off, leaving more endosperm to make white flour. By the time you got to the bakers, they wanted more bread for less wheat. So you see all these bread tests, all those are made with the same amount of wheat. Okay, now imagine this. If you're a baker and you can sell air for the price of bread. Does that sound pretty good? And that's what they're doing. The biggest low volume on your right is full of air. And that's what they can sell they're selling mostly by the loaves now instead of by the pound, so it doesn't really matter. And this is what everybody's excited about. And so that's what's happening. Now, this came with several unintended consequences. And many had to do with the people who all of a sudden or very shortly were not able to eat this kind of bread anymore. And the gluten had been changed to make more flexible gluten to hold more air, so that's why we have a bigger loaf of bread. The loaf volumes are increased because the gluten is able to hold more air in bubbles. It forms like balloons in the bread. That was great for the bakers, but not so great for people whose systems couldn't digest that gluten very easily. And so we had that problem that showed up. Another thing the bakers started doing was using fast-rising yeast. Fast-rising yeast works so fast that it only gives time for the bread to digest the sugar that they put in the dough and doesn't really get to digesting the gluten and the starches and other things that make up the dough, but it goes right into the oven because it's raised up real nice on the sugar diet, and then they go to the next batch. If you contrast that with sourdough, which I don't know if you guys know this, but in research published out of Colorado, in 48 hours, about 96%, after 48-hour fermentation, 96% of all the gluten is gone. It's destroyed. It's been pre-digested. So when you eat sourdough, even with shorter fermentation, that 24 hours or even 12 hours or so, you're eating a product that's partially digested, partially broken down, so that your body can more easily finish the process. And that makes a big difference for people who have some types of sensitivity to gluten. Another problem is the more and more prevalence of glyphosate in our food, and wheat is no exception to that, and it gets into the flour and then into the bread. Glyphosate acts as an antibiotic, so it not only kills plants, it disrupts a certain pathway that only plants have. Human cells don't have that, mammals don't have that. But guess what else in the world has it? Many bacteria have the same pathway, and they are also destroyed. So if you spray glyphosate on your soil for weed control, in a no-till situation for chem fallow, the more glyphosate you spray, the deader is your dirt. And we don't want dead dirt. We want living soil. So it's just going backwards to what we really need and want. And guess where else we find bacteria? And you all well know the answer to that question right here in your gut. There's more bacteria in your gut than human cells in your body. And if you start disrupting those by killing off a certain portion of them, eating an antibiotic, even in very small doses, you're starting to get many weird symptoms happening to you, and many of those symptoms are similar to what people describe as wheat sensitivities. So sometimes those wheat sensitivities are not wheat at all, they're glyphosate. So here we are in the present. We need to change the future. And if we look at wheat, in that three-legged stool I mentioned early on, the chances of success are over 90% for non-celiac folks. Now, I'm not going to recommend this for any celiac because that can be life and death, and it's a much more serious situation. But for wheat sensitivities that are non-celiac, if you do these four things, or your friends or whoever is affected by this, I pretty much can guarantee they're going to be 90%. I don't know who the 10% are. That doesn't work. But 90% assured that they will have no more problems with wheat. Particularly if they've been to Europe and they say, oh, I can eat the wheat bread there and I can't eat it here. Then for sure they're going to be okay. First of all, eat only organic. That'll eliminate the glyphosate question. Eat only heirloom and ancient wheats. That'll eliminate the messing with the gluten. Eat only whole wheat so that you're not throwing away a third of the nutrition that's there to help your body be strong and healthy anyway. And eat sourdough instead of short fermentations. Eat long fermentations of bread. If you do those four things and have a pre-digestion going on, you'll make it very much easier for your system to be okay on wheat. So let's talk about the future of food system for a second. You know, I haven't talked so much about the high cost of cheap food. You know, we have a big cheap food policy in this country, but it comes at a very high cost. Comes to a high cost for our farmers, our communities, our planet, and our health. And I get talking another half hour about that, but I don't have another half hour. But you can read that in the book too. But wonder if the farmers were paid a fair price at the farm gate, and wages were paid, and workers were paid a fair wage for their work in all levels of food production. Wonder if communities, because of this, were able to be revitalized and have more jobs. Wonder if the planet had a reduce of a pollution, a mediation of our climate cage, which I refer to mostly as climate chaos because that's what I see, by the sequestration of carbon and by the elimination of greenhouse gases used, or that is a result of the production of chemicals, fertilizers for chemical agriculture. And wonder if we could reduce chronic disease, which is rampant in this country. So, okay. So, remember this, that all of us are really co-producers, and for real change, we really need to get to know each other and our challenges and our problems together. And work together for something that is really a system where everybody wins. Let me give you a little enthusiasm, some hope. In the last 35 years, we've gone from just about zero organic in the grocery stores to 7%. At the current rate of growth, which is between 7 and 8%, over the next 35 years, starting at 7%, we will be over 100. So our generation, I'm a torch passer. I'm getting to be a torch passer now, no longer a torch bearer. I'm passing my torch to the next generation. But the next generation, particularly you younger ends of that generation, and then your next 35 years, you can finish the job that we have just begun. And if you look at it like this, we're halfway there. We've solved it. We solved half of the problem just by getting up to where we are now. Let me share with you, just the last minute or two I have, a Super Bowl commercial. Anybody seen this? The one on organic? Have you seen this? This is coming to the Super Bowl. This is going to be really fun. Let's see. Let's get the right button here. Okay.
America. Less than 1% of our farmland is organic. And farmers who want to transition face monumental challenges. What if we could help them? Simply by having a beer. Michelob Ultra Pure Gold introduces 6 for 6 pack. Pick up a 6-pack. We'll help transition 6 square feet of farmland to organic. So imagine all these riders go for a 6-pack. This can go organic. If everyone who moves like Ben gets one, all of this can turn organic. 6-pack, 6 square feet. And if every football fan picks up a 6-pack, we could change America's organic farmland forever.
Okay. I'm not even a beer drinker, you see, but I see a great idea in marketing when I know it when I see it. And imagine if all of us, when we sold what we grow on our farm to or wherever we're selling it, say this package, this bag, this loaf of bread represents this many square feet of organic agriculture that is good for you and good for the planet. Wouldn't that be a fun thing to do? And I think this kind of an idea is a great idea. So anyway, this is, what can we do together? This is some big drivers I see in just the last minute. I'm going to go through this really quick. If we could tie food security to homeland security, and I'm not talking when I say homeland security about a Big Ben in Kansas that has enough wheat for the whole country. I'm talking about community security, having each community. I heard some great talks this morning about what's starting to happen here in New Jersey about grain security. If we tied food to health and say, you hear a lot of talk about healthcare, universal healthcare. Healthcare, it's not really healthcare at all, it's sick care. But I wonder if we talked about universal health. And we can do that if we talk about food, organic food. If we tie liability to ownership, have the idea of the polluter pays. If we tie organic agriculture to solution for climate change, I already talked about that. As a result of a question I asked this morning, how much land would it take to feed the Northeast with their own grain? The population, I was told, is nearly 55 million people, according to my phone that knows everything. The country right now is eating per person about 132 pounds of wheat annually. If you multiply those two, you come up with 7.3 billion pounds of wheat. In this country, where it actually rains, I think you can get 60 bushel, which is 60 pounds an acre, which would be 3,600 pounds an acre, which you divide that into 7.2 billion is about 2 million acres to grow your grain in the Northeast, including New York and New Jersey. And the number of acres in those states that's under cultivated, in farmland, it's called farmland, is 12 million. So the amount needed for wheat is 16%. That's 1/6. That gives you an opportunity for a 6-year rotation, where those other 5 years you can be growing your vegetables and your oilseed crops and your dairy, and it's possible. Regional sustainability is possible. And there's no reason why not to take the example that I heard this morning with the River Valley folks and multiply that all over this region. And that is what food security would look like. So what about Montana, where we can't grow vegetables, they say? Well, this is my 28-pound watermelon that I grew dryland here. Not this last year because it was a disaster, but the year before, which is getting to be more normal. We can grow stuff where we don't think we can, just by practicing. And that's my work of hope. This is some of the repeating of what I've already said, so I'm not going to go through that because we're out of time, and I want to leave a few minutes for questions. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. I must also tell you that Liz and I started this book tour campaign, or whatever we want to call it, presentations, a year ago. So we donated a year of our life to it. And this is the last time we're going to be together. We started at the very end of February last year, and now we're at the beginning of February in 2020. And so thank you for that appreciation. And I want to thank Liz again for being a great co-author. And really the reason that we were able to put this all together. So thank you. Anyway, you just have a few minutes, right? Do you have any questions? Yes, over here.
I want to know, what do the other farmers think of this? Because in the farming community, sometimes when you keep doing the same thing and a new guy comes in your case when you were younger, you had to convince your father. What did you have to do now to convince some of the farmers out there as well?
Well,
are they seeing the difference, and they're seeing the the case studies and seeing the difference out there?
That's a really good question. When I first came back and then started doing this organic stuff, they thought I'd been in California too long. That was the first reaction. Then they thought, well, he must be spraying at night. Because this can't possibly work, it's just going against all of what we know to be true. And then the chemical companies, they started spreading the line, well, he's got a PhD, and you got to have a PhD to make this work, which is another way of saying the rest of you guys are so dumb, you can't do it. I don't know how many got that innuendo. But we went through a lot of first of making fun of us, to unbelieving of what was going on, and to finally now, it's been over 30 years, and we're still there, and many of our neighbors are gone. And I've probably had more calls in the last 18 months than I've had in the last 30 years of people who are really desperate to save their farm, wondering how they might be able to start on the this path. And I said, Mom, that's what I'm here for. I'm glad to help you. And so that's been really a big turnaround. Even my friends at Farm Bureau, I'm still a member of Farm Bureau, and I go to Grain Grower Convention to hear what Monsanto's saying to them, and just to see what's going on. And I spoke at Farm Bureau meeting this summer, and a guy came up to me afterwards and doing a book signing, and he said, well, he says, I don't pay any cotton or take any cotton of this stuff. It's organic stuff, only he used quite a bit colorful language, more colorful language than that. But he says, I see what you're talking about, climate of the small towns and the farmers going broke all over. And he says, I want to buy your book. And I thought, wow, that's why I wrote it. I didn't really write it for the choir. I wrote it for the people who are on the fringe of our fringe, and not totally, absolutely, completely sold to the point they're not even going to ask a question, but seeing problems popping up all kinds of places and really not knowing where to go or where to turn to solve it. And that's where I'm feeling the greatest satisfaction of people getting ideas or encouragement for my experience. So, thank you for that. Yes?
If you were to take over a conventional farm and you wanted to grow grain, what would be your cover crop choice in the first?
Well,
Repeat the question.
oh, thank you. The question was if I were going to start with a non-organic farm, and what would I do? What would be my cover crops of choice to make it for the rotation to work? Because if you're not building the soil, and that's part of the regenerative effort. Now, you folks here in the east, where your winters are measured in weeks, maybe instead of months, depending on the year, of course, you can grow a lot of cover crops clear through the winter that we can't, or most of the way through the winter that we can't. You have really more choices than we have. We're taking our fields out of grain production for a whole year to grow a cover crop for part of that year and to nourish the soil. So I would, wherever you're at, I would look and contact successful organic farmers who are already doing it and have done all the experimentation. There's no reason for each new farmer there's going to be enough experimentation just to tweak their own little farm. But don't start from zero. Go to the neighbors or if there's a good academic center that's doing some sustainable and organic stuff, go and talk to them and talk to the people in your locale that are having success and get some ideas from them. Because every region, the principles are the same, but the application is really subject to the region that you're in best. So, thank you. Yes?
A couple more questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Are you in charge of questions?
Nope, you are. I just want to keep this.
All right. There is one right here in the front.
A couple more questions right here. So.
Okay, fine.
How much of a gap, if any, do you see between what the USDA qualifies as organic and what is necessary to create truly regenerative production systems?
So what kind of a gap is there between what USDA defines organic and the regenerative organic that we're talking about now? That's a good question. When we first, when I was on the first NOSB, we started from zero. We're just trying to create something that can get off the ground. And so we tried to get as much as possible the basics in place and hope that they would be built upon in the spirit of what was started. That hasn't completely happened. So we have, mostly we have what we started with. It hasn't been changed a great deal. And the finishing touches of defining more completely confinement animal systems, for example, has been blockaded and diverted, and we haven't been able to kind of finish the job on that. More specifics of soil building like we understand now haven't really been addressed. So it's possible to follow the letter of the law without really following the spirit of the law. And if you're really focused on the letter and doing the minimum amount, then you're going to miss some of the things that we've been talking about. And what's beginning to happen now, and it's very strong here in the Northeast and with Rodale, is regenerative organic certification, which is another level of certification beyond the organic certification. It was our hope that we could move USDA along so that we wouldn't need that. It's still a defined, a definition is very important and dear to us because at least it's defined in law of what organic means. And it's a big difference from non-organic. And I don't think we should lose sight of that. And we can focus on, you can focus on the trouble more than the success and become discouraged. But there's no reason you can't have both. Focus on what we have succeeded and where we're going in a positive way, and then make your own choices to improve it as much as possible and include these other regenerative ideas.
Okay, we have our last question.
Not even a question, just super quick. Can you put back up the slide that you did with the 55 million people?
Sure.
I wanted to just take a picture of that.
Okay. Now I just put that together this afternoon, so
No, but it's still fun.
if you see something that's not jiving, just let me know.
Okay, so we can take Mark's question.
Okay,
Yes?
since that wasn't a question. In terms of your fertility inputs, how are you able to generate fertility on-site as opposed to bring it on-site from an off-farm source? How do you balance those two inputs?
Well, I don't bring any inputs on from off farm. We have land that's been farmed, if you count the number of crops that have been raised the last 100 years. Well, homesteaders came into our area in about 1916 to 17, 15, 16, 17. So it's been farmed for just a little over 100 years. We've only had 50 crops taken off of that. Certainly the basic fertility of the soil cannot handle 100 crops, but the mineralization certainly can. And then when you add, what we've tried to add back is the biology. A viable soil microbiological system that really keeps everything rolling. And that's, I think, the secret to success. We still do soil tests and looking at nitrogen pretty carefully because that's really a big determinant on yield and protein and whatnot for our grains. And our nitrogen levels, compared to what the university says we have to get the yields that we're having, which are pretty close to county averages. This myth about organic starving the world, that's just a lie. And by people who want to sell you stuff. But our fertility is probably only 60 to 50% of what the university says is required to grow a chemical crop of wheat at the yield and the protein we have. And so where's the other 40%? What's it coming from? It's coming from the life in the soil, the bacteriological. And we don't really, it's probably more than numerous things coming in together. But that's the summation of it. So we're feeding the soil and not the plants. Let that go, yes.
As a soil fertility specialist here at Rutgers, I find that answer very interesting. Almost all the soil fertility, soil test calibration research is done under conventional. And I suspect, and at least it's my hypothesis, but I don't have any data, but I suspect that what we consider sufficiency or critical levels may well be different and possibly lower for an organic system.
And that's what we've seen. And also we're under criticism all the time for mining the soil for potassium. We don't add we haven't added any potassium or potash at this point, or phosphate, I'm sorry, phosphate. And that's a critical element, of course, in plant growth.
The soils are functioning differently. And so
it is, and I think the mycorrhiza is probably, our soils are fairly high pH. And so they say, well, how is it solubilizing the phosphorus? Because it's all tied up with high pH. But I'm guessing that the isolated environments around the mycorrhiza are solubilizing that. And you will know better than I. I'm not a soil scientist, but that's what my observation has been.
Well, I think it makes sense.
Well,
Thank you.
Benny, I want to give a